Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 2 of my card review for the new cards that are being revealed in the One Night in Karazhan adventure. This time around I have 4 new cards to take a look at, so let's go ahead and jump right in with the first new card reveal. This is Moroes, the Butler there in Karazhan. And he's a 3-mana neutral legendary. But I have to say, I don't think this card feels like a legendary, either in effect, stats, quality, all around. I just don't love this card. Of course, he's a 1/1 for 3 mana, so that's terrible to start with. But he does have stealth, so slight bonus point. But then his effect, which is where all his upside's supposed to be, right? Because you don't expect a 3-mana card to be a 1/1. Is at the end of your turn, summon a 1/1 steward. So I guess the idea with this card, right, is sort of an infinite value card. Since he's stealthed, theoretically he could just stay on the board forever and generate you a 1/1 every turn for free. So 15 turns later, right, you could have gotten a total of 16/16 in stats for only 3 mana. So you think about it that way, that's kind of cool. But unfortunately, as a 1 health minion with stealth, although the opponent may not be able to target it with their hero power, there are so many AoE cards, area of effect cards, that do 1 damage to the board. So not only the Flame Strikes and the Blizzards of the world, but also Consecration. Any whirlwind effect from any card, particularly Warrior, which is one of the most prominent classes on the ladder right now, swipes. Just anything, Lightning Storm, it doesn't matter, every class has a way to remove this. So there's a very good chance that it might live for 1 or 2 turns, but at some point your opponent is going to have a mechanism to deal with it, sometimes accidentally, just from a whirlwind effect that the warrior was trying to proc themselves. So I think most of the time you're going to get a 2/2 or maybe a 3/3 total stat value out of this card, which isn't that great. So secondary uses, of course, is like in a paladin. I could see this maybe working. You got the Steward of Darkshire, so you've got some name synergy since he's summoning stewards. And each time he summons it, it would also gain a divine shield. So there's some potential synergies there. Plus, of course, in a class like paladin, anything with stealth is a good buff target. So if you keep him on the board and you're able to buff him, then it might be more difficult for your opponents to deal with him. And he does start to generate infinite value or just serve as a body to attack with that fresh buff. So, I mean, there are some angles that this card could work in certain specific kinds of decks. But still, I just think there are better alternatives. Like maybe you'd just rather run like a Silent Knight, a 2/2 Divine Shield. That's stealth for 3 mana, like does kind of the same stuff. It's getting you essentially 3/3 in stats thanks to that Divine Shield. So I don't know where Moroes fits. Maybe we'll see some other cards that synergize with him. I don't even think he works in like a zoo deck that well, just because he's a little bit too slow as far as this, how quickly it takes the stats to really build up and gain you long-term value. So I don't love Moroes. I think he's pretty subpar, but I'm curious to see if there are any other pieces in One Night in Karazhan that opens him up as a stronger card. So let's go ahead and move on to the next neutral card that is revealed in this bunch. This time it's the 6-mana dragon bookworm. Goofy name and even goofier art, but I like it. This is a 3/6 dragon for 6 mana with a pretty cool battle cry. If you're holding a dragon, destroy an enemy minion with 3 or less attack. So this is basically a Stampeding Kodo, but instead of 2 or less attack, this time around it's 3 or less attack. And that is a huge distinction. There aren't that many good minions with 2 or less attack. In fact, most of them cost 2 or less mana. But there are some really strong minions across the game with 3 or less attack. A lot of decks utilize 3 attack minions as very important pieces of their deck, right? Twilight Guardians, for instance, in dragon decks are suddenly susceptible to bookworm. Fandral Staghelm, suddenly susceptible to bookworm. And the list goes on and on, right? There are tons of 3 attack minions that are super strong and big threats, and this gives late game control style dragon decks a really good answer to those. I don't know that this card is runnable in something like the aggro slash mid-range dragon warrior that's so prominent in the meta right now, just because that's a very fast card, or a very fast deck, and this card's not quite that fast. It's a little slower, doesn't have that aggressive of a stat stance. It's more about addressing your opponent than hitting the face. But there's a lot of value packed into this card. A 3/6 body's fine, the battle cry is super strong. It's a dragon itself, so it also helps proc other dragon synergy cards, which is nice. So this feels like a very playable card in dragon decks. And frankly, it could even just be like a control card. If you happen to have a deck that runs a couple dragons, like that random Ysera or Alcazars or whatever, you might want to run a copy of this just to proc an effect. It's almost like Bryn Blackhand's Destroy a Legendary effect if you hold a dragon, but this one's even more generalized, so you can get value out of it more consistently than with Rend. So a lot of cool potential play in this card, I think. A very strong, playable, and interesting design. It's the modern day upgrade to the Stampeding Kodo, which is also a playable card. So let's go ahead and move on to the next card. This is the first of 2 1-mana cards that have been revealed. This time it's the Warlock card Malchezaar's Imp. This is a 1-mana 1/3 demon that has an effect whenever you discard a card, you also draw a card. So clearly there are some discard synergy ideas coming to mind with this card. You've got stuff like Fist of Jaraxxus. You've got other discard cards like Doomguard or Succubus. There's quite a few that Warlock has access to now. So certainly there probably is a line of play where this fits into a discard style deck. Those have not really taken off yet. Don't seem that powerful. But each new piece they get that makes them better, Malchezaar's Imp could be the card that pushes them over the edge as an early game discard setup card. He does have actually a pretty strong effect just because it's consistent card draw, predictable card draw. And if you have this on the board when you play Doomguard, you're drawing 2 cards theoretically. You're also discarding cards, right? So it's an even trade, but the way discards work, right? The stuff that's left in your hand is sometimes, or at least maybe usually, the least desirable pieces. You haven't played them yet. They're probably weaker. You can choose what to discard to some extent, right? With the Doomguard, you can play the Doomguard when you want. Leave the junky Argent Squire and Soulfire in your hand. Play Doomguard and discard the junk and get 2 new cards to fill in right after that Doomguard curve. So I don't know. It could work. We haven't seen discard decks take off, but I even think this card is maybe sorta kinda playable in Zoo. It's got good stats as a 1/3. In other words, it's a body that's likely to survive the early game. It's not quite a Flame Imp, but it does set up for buffs nicely. And if you run Doomguards in Zoo, then there is a chance this gets you a ton of value when you play those Doomguards. And this might even open up something like Succubus in Zoo, right? Who knows if Succubus has always been a little too risky to play because you don't usually want to discard your cards on turn 2. But if you've got more upside like this that helps you keep your hand full and flexible, maybe it opens up more options to make Zoo even better than it already is. Not like Warlock needs that. But otherwise, if you don't have discard, if you don't run the Doomguards, it's a worse Voidwalker, right? So maybe not great in that angle, but an interesting card. I think it's probably like a 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10 if I had to rate it. I don't think it's super strong or deck defining, but perhaps playable in the right scenario or situation, or if some other cards unlock some unseen synergies that we haven't opened up this far. So let's go ahead and move on to the last card in this review. It is a new Mage 1-mana minion. It's the Babbling Book. It's a 1/1, and it has a battle cry: add a random mage spell to your hand. So, this is basically a Novice Engineer that's a little cheaper. Instead of 2 mana, it's 1 mana, but the same size body and more or less the same effect, right? This is a draw a card effect, but actually substantially worse than a draw a card effect, and that's why this is a cheaper card than Novice Engineer, because the random mage spell you add to your hand may not synergize with your deck at all. It's totally unpredictable. It doesn't thin out your deck. It's an additional card, which gives you more resources than running a single spell in your deck. So the problem with this card, of course, is the randomness of it. Sometimes you're going to get arcane missiles that you don't need. Sometimes you're going to get pyroblast that you don't need. Sometimes you're going to get that perfect ice block too, or the perfect fireball for lethal. Those things will happen, but it's totally unpredictable, and I think it's not good. There's just not enough upside on this body that this card would be better to run in your deck than the spell you want. In other words, if you really need a fireball, just run a fireball. If you really need damage spells, run damage spells. If you need defensive spells, run defensive spells. Adding a Babbling Book might give you the opposite of what you need, and it took up that slot. It took up a draw in the late game. It's just a risky card to run when you could run more consistent things that you choose. So outside of like some casino style mage, as they're called, with super random effects, I don't know. This is perhaps playable in Tempo Mage, just because you don't really care necessarily what spells you have all the time in Tempo Mage, as long as you have spells. And this does allow you to get out onto the board in a somewhat aggressive fashion, but it just dies so easily and it doesn't trade at all. I don't think the 1/1 body is worth the risk of the random card. So I don't like this card particularly well. I don't think it's super playable. I think it's a little bit weak. And if it was a Discover effect, it'd be amazing, of course. Perhaps overpowered, but that would get it closer to a good card in my mind, because right now I just don't think it's worth it. If it was a 1/3, it would be playable. But it's a 1/1, it just dies too easily. It doesn't do anything to the board, and the randomness is just too risky. So that said, that's going to wrap it up for part 2 of my one night in Karazhan card review. Babbling Book is not great. Alcazars Imp is probably okay. Bookworm, I think, is really solid, and Moroes is pretty disappointing for a legendary. So if you have any questions about my review of these cards, or you want to share thoughts of your own, please do leave a comment. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.